All right, I think it's safe to start. Hi, everyone. My name's Erica. I work for CodeDay. I'm the CodeDay manager, here to introduce Bill Clark for a second year in a row at CodeDay Labs presenting about game development. So I'm just going to let you take it away and, tell people a little bit about yourself. Please fill up the Q&A, and we will answer your questions. Yeah, take it away, Bill.
Cool. Thank you, Erica. I'm the lead gameplay engineer at a new studio called TiMi Seattle that I'll talk about in a little bit. But yeah, I had a good time presenting about game engines last year, and I'm a little bit busier, so I didn't have time to make like an entirely new presentation. But I figured an AMA would still be fun. So let's talk a little bit about my history so you get a sense of what type of questions you can ask. I started off in the game industry at 343 Industries working on Halo 4, started in 2008. And so I was there for almost 5 years. I spent a little bit of time as like a gameplay programmer working on like physics and controls, but then most of the time on that project I was the visual effects programmer, and so I was working with effects artists on making explosions and sparks and fire and stuff like that. And in particular, we spent a lot of time working on an effect that you can see here on all of these images, where characters dissolve into a bunch of particles that drift away. And so that was a substantial amount of time to get that working over the network, and like making it look good the way that the artist wanted it to. So then after 343, I went over to Valve Software for almost a year working on Dota 2. I spent a little bit of time working on the core 5v5 MOBA game mode, but then more of my time that I was there, I was working on custom games. And that was basically enabling players to create their own, script up and create their own game modes. And in particular, we released the Wraith Night game mode for a Christmas holiday event. Not Christmas, holiday event, sorry. And So that was a 5-player cooperative survival mode. And in particular, I did a decent amount of design work on that mode, including implementing the final boss fight against the Wraith King. After I was at Valve, I then went down to Santa Monica to work at Riot Games on League of Legends. Um, Over the course of my time there, I did a lot of gameplay programming, a little bit of design work, and some tools programming. Um, and then, sort of the last half of my time there, I was the engineering lead for the champions team, creating new champions. And so I personally worked on, in this image, Rakan of Zion Rakan, Yumi the cat, Aatrox, this sword demon dude, and Set, who's a brawler, like wrestler. And then the other thing that happened while I was at Riot that's of note is that I wrote an article called A Taxonomy of Tech Debt. This was based upon me observing the ways in which decisions that had been made years ago in the construction of League of Legends were still causing us problems, and taking time, and making development go slower. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that, and like how to talk about it and how to decide which tech debt to fix. And so I came up with a set of 3 measurements of the impact of the tech debt, both on the player experience, but also on developers. The fixed cost, which is like how much time would it take to fix this problem that you have, as well as what is the risk of fixing it. And then the new idea that seemed to really catch on was contagion, which is the idea of, if I don't fix this problem in my game, how much is it going to spread into other systems, like the longer it exists and the longer we keep developing. And yeah, so that article has been like, it blew up. It was kind of stunning, like kind of overwhelming, like how much it hit that week. And then I have friends at other companies that have told me, oh yeah, we use that framework now. So it feels kind of weird to say I'm an expert on tech debt, because that's not something that seems fun to be an expert on, but I am. So I mean, at least the internet thinks I am. So so I'm happy to talk about that. Um, After I left Riot, I spent about a year doing solo development at a by myself, and calling myself LtRandolph Games. I spent about 6 months of that time working on a 2D Metroidvania game called Kinematic that I never released. I learned a lot about about how to build games, and I built my own engine. And then I also learned about overscoping and how easy it is to try to make a game that's way too big for yourself. Then I did a game jam, and in a week I built Craft Defense on the Pico 8 platform, which is a fantasy console. It's kind of like pretend that this console existed and then write emulation for it. Uh, and this game was a big success. It wound up winning the game jam. It's a small game jam, but still, I'm proud of it, and I really like it. So I'm very proud of that work. And then the other thing that happened over the course of my time as Lieutenant Randolph Games was that I created a YouTube series called Game Design Principles, which I talk about. There are several episodes about tower defenses because I was spending a lot of time thinking about that. But then there's also one about boss fights and various other things. And basically, I just like break down aspects of game design into a very like bullet point based, because that's the way my brain works, very bullet point based systems. And so, for example, on boss fights, I describe four measurements, four axes that you can measure a boss fight on, and try to design so that the boss fights throughout your game have different feels from each other, that they can be quick and high intensity and very punishing versus long and endurance and stuff like that. And then in February, I joined a very small studio called Symmetry that created the Dark Souls-like game Mortal Shell. While I was there, I helped implement ray tracing into that game for players who have NVIDIA RTX cards. And then I also did some amount of work setting up the prototype for an upcoming game from that studio. But I wound up leaving in July to join TiMi Seattle. So TiMi is a group of studios that are part of the Tencent Corporation. Tencent is an enormous Chinese corporation that Tencent, among other things, it owns 100% of Riot Games and a decent amount of Epic and of various other game studios. But TiMi is one of their internal studio groups. And relatively recently, it was announced that TiMi opened the Seattle studio that I'm a part of, as well as a Montreal studio. And I think there was one other North American studio, but I don't remember where it was. And so that's where I'm at. And I've been there for 2 weeks. So working in Unreal Engine and just getting started. So that's who I am. So what questions we got?
Thank you so much, Bill, for introducing yourself and talking about all of the projects that you've worked on. So impressive. Everyone is like hyped. So the first question that I feel like is really common is how realistic is a career in the games industry? I've heard it's hard to get a job, and people often do feel really discouraged in entering, the gaming industry as a whole in general.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if you could answer that and also give some tips on how to like avoid this discouragement.
Sure. Yeah. So I will say, like it how easy it is to get in. I mean, as you say, it's never easy, but like how doable it is to get in depends a lot on what career track you go on. Um, and so like engineering in general, programming is one of the easier ways to get in terms of in terms of competing with other candidates, in terms of like getting in front of a recruiter, in terms of actually getting a phone call with a manager, versus like design in particular is probably the hardest to get into, because of a number of things, including that it's harder to like show exactly, like to demonstrate that you're a good designer than to demonstrate that you're a good programmer, because it's more subjective and it can take a longer time to evaluate somebody. Plus designer is the role that like the most people want to do, and like the most different types of degrees could theoretically get you in, and so those are sort of the two opposite ends in terms of like easiest for programming and hardest for design. But some of the ways that can help you get in include like there are studios that are doing less glamorous work. There are studios that make casino games, that make mobile games, that make sort of like smaller, simpler things. Those in general are an easier place to get your foot in the door if you don't already have experience. and then if like the most like start from the ground and work your way up to get in is if you have some other trade that you want to be doing. You want to be doing art or design or programming. uh, you can start in QA and start as a tester of some sort, and that is a way to get your foot in the door that most studios like have as part of the framework, that like a lot of the QA people are trying to get into some other role, and QA is how they get to know the team and develop and show their work ethic and stuff like that. So, but yeah, I would say if you have a skill that can work somewhere else in some other industry, you will be paid more, and it will be easier to get a job in something other than games, because it's a basic like supply and demand economics thing of people are excited about working in games and thus are willing to be paid less, or need to be paid less and compete with each other, because there's a supply of people who want to work in games, um, that is larger than, relatively speaking, than like the people who want to make websites or work in financial tech or whatever. So does that answer the question?
Yeah, and do you have any tips about navigating that discouragement that
Mm,
people
mhm.
face when wanting to enter games?
Yeah. So uh, I would definitely say that so you need to look at what your financial situation is, what your sort of like needs are to in order to be able to survive, because we live in a capitalist society where you need money to survive. And so like figure out like what you need in order to be able to sort of like maintain your ability to live, and like what sort of time frame you've got before you would need to get a job. And that's always got to be something that you're keeping track of. And so like one of the ways that can be good is if you get a job that pays the bills and doesn't leave you completely exhausted, which can be difficult. Again, we're in a capitalist society. But if you can do that, then that can buy you a lot of time to like be putting out your resumes or working on a portfolio or whatever, and sort of like have less of the, oh my god, my life is going to fall apart if I don't get a job in the next 2 months type of a situation. Another thing I would say is game jams, I think, are excellent for anyone who has interest in game development, regardless of whether they're trying to get in the industry or not. If you participate in a game jam, you're going to um, either build something by yourself and learn a lot about the process of making it, or you're going to work with a team of people with a wide variety of experience levels and learn from them. And I've observed both with myself as well as with some people that I've been in touch with who are trying to get into the game industry, like how much just making 3, 4, 5 games each in 3 days to a week, like you get way better, and it shows in terms of like, in particular, like trying to get into design, but also any other way that you're trying to get into the industry. If you have a portfolio and you can say, look at these games that I made these 4 games for these 4 game jams, and this one placed fifth or whatever, like that on a website like makes you way more compelling, and also way more sort of like evaluatable by the person who's considering hiring you. So yeah, like I think game jams are a great way to both like put your foot in the water and see like, do I actually like doing this, and also sort of develop your skills and sort of maintain the excitement about like, yeah, I've actually made something and I've actually accomplished something here. But yeah.
That's really great advice. Thank you.
Hmm.
To everyone listening, come to Code Day. We have 24-hour coding marathons that are very similar to game jams, and you
Nice.
can practice building games,
Hmm.
and it's a fun time. Somebody asks, I feel like this is pretty relevant. Is the work life balance as a game programmer difficult for you?
Hmm. It's a good question. It definitely varies from studio to studio. I think over the past decade in particular, like since EA Spouse and some of the other like big internet things, uh, it is more and more a conversation that happens um, when you're in the interview process talking to a studio. Like, they will typically address, here are our expectations. Um, and so I'm at a fortunate position that, unfortunately, like, it will take you a while to get to if you get into the industry, because I've been in for 13 years at this point. And so when I talk to a studio, I if I don't hear from the leadership, we care about people's work life balance, here are the ways that we try to ensure people are looking out for themselves, then I will not talk to that studio. But that's I recognize that that's a luxury. Um, that said, like, so you look at some of the horror stories, like Red Dead Redemption 2 is reported to have had like extreme crunch. Um, that exists, absolutely, and that is something that I think it's unfortunate that it exists, and it's something that exists again because of that same problem I mentioned earlier of, like, so many people want to work in games, that a studio that doesn't recognize the problems of burnout isn't going to be punished very much. They'll just have to hire more people. But I, like, as a leader and as a developer myself, like, I strongly believe that a studio is going to be more successful if it doesn't overwork its people. And, like, there's plenty of economics data to back this up. People have been studying this for 100 years about, like, the effect of working 40 hours a week versus 50, 60, 70. Um, I have had to crunch a few times in my career. And also when I was at Riot, and I was moving into management, I did myself, because I cared about the product and because I was struggling with, how do I know that I'm doing a good job as a manager, I would then sort of burn the candle at both ends and also try to write good code. And so, like, I have put myself into a position where I have burned myself out. But it's been a while since the studio has expected me to work the types of hours that would burn me out. So.
That's totally fair. And I have gamer friends, gaming industry friends that have said pretty much the same thing.
Mhm,
Tyler asks, can you talk about different career paths and specialties in the game industry and
mhm.
kind of break them down?
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, as I said, like, I'm a programmer. There are a variety of sort of specialties of in terms of programming that you can be, doing servers and big data and stuff like that, about, like, how the internet side of it works. So you can be doing gameplay programming or rendering programming that are going into the game itself, or there's tools programming and build programming that are sort of like how the game is being developed within the studio. So there's that sort of like breadth of ideas within programming. Then there's within design. Design broadly is coming up with what are the interactions and the systems that the player is going to engage with, like when they push buttons or when they spend currency or when they uh, get into their 50th match. These are all questions that designers will be answering. And it'll vary how technical it is depending mostly on the studio. So, like, some studios expect a designer to be thinking a lot, writing down notes, and then talking to a programmer who implements things. Other studios expect designers to be writing script in Python, and be fully capable of programming, just not as technical as the engineers, and that'll vary. So then art is another major discipline that has a whole bunch of subcategories within it. There's character artists, concept artists, animation, technical artists that are sort of like helping make sure that the other artists' work can get into the engine effectively. Um, and I'm sure I missed some subcategories, but yeah, broadly, art is producing pixels on the screen. There's sound design and voiceover design, which are sometimes two separate things and sometimes the same person, as well as composition, like composing music. And so those are all people who are putting together sounds. I mentioned QA. There are, in general, I think of two different types of quality assurance. One of them is like a hands-on tester who is playing the game constantly, and different studios will give different levels of respect to testers like this. It's really a shame, but some studios treat them as completely expendable, like almost treat them like just sort of monkeys who are pushing buttons. And I find that really shameful. but it does exist. And then other studios, like some studios, that's the only type of testing they have. But many studios, particularly ones that I think have a better sense of the value of testing, will also have QA analysts that are doing things that are more thinking systematically about how do we test what needs to be tested, how do we sort of spend our time, and then we'll help coordinate a mix of automated testing that a computer can run as well as what are our button pressing testers doing. But I would say like Riot as a great example is a place that even the people who are pushing the buttons and playing the game using their physical hands are very respected and are treated as important. And I think like that's a sign of a good studio culture. So I always look for that of like how do you treat your QA can be a sign of like how much you understand how important QA is. And then let's see. So the other two that I can think of is there's narrative. That these are people who are potentially writing dialogue or potentially writing just sort of like briefs that like books and pages of stuff that are internal to the studio. So whether it's player facing or not, these are the people that are coming up with the prose and the stories about what's going on. And finally, the role of producer. Sometimes it's divided into several different categories. Sometimes there's just one. But broadly speaking, a producer is responsible for, does everyone know what they're doing? Is everyone agreed on sort of what the values and goals are? And is everyone capable of effectively working together and getting their job done? And so at Riot, I think it made a lot of sense to me. There was split into two different types, that there was a product owner who is responsible for the what are we building, why are we building it, and does everyone agree that it's great? And development managers who are responsible for how's the team doing, are they communicating, what sprint are we expecting the feature to land on, and like all the coordination. And so like that breakdown made a lot of sense to me, but other studios will have one or the other of those. Either they might be mushed together, or it might be that engineers are responsible for the organization side and design is responsible for the creative side. So it varies, but broadly speaking, producers are, I think, essential to a good studio functioning. But yeah, exactly what they're doing will vary.
That was super insightful. Thank you for breaking like literally all of that down.
Yeah.
Sam asks, did you have a degree, and what experience do you think helped you get your first job in the game industry?
Yeah, so I got a computer science degree from Caltech down in Pasadena. And I specifically focused on graphics. I took every graphics course that the school offered, and as well as created a graphics course, because they said that school is very theoretical and mathy in terms of the computer science degree. And so I had self-taught how to program. GPU programming is the graphics processing unit, but you could also call it video card. So like writing the code that runs on the video card. So I self-taught that skill, and then with a classmate, we put together a course on how to do GPU programming. And so yeah, so like that was sort of my background as I finished up at Caltech was like very deep in graphics. And I will say I absolutely cannot discount the fact that there was a person who was a Caltech alum who was at Microsoft at the studio that became 343, who then came and recruited on campus, and like that was a huge in, and it sucks that sometimes that can make the difference for somebody. So I would say like I don't know that my path is repeatable because it relied on a connection with somebody else that if I had been at a similarly good school, I wouldn't have had the talk to Kuda who works at 343 and sort of like make that connection. And so yeah, so what I would say though, in terms of the second part of the question of like what would I recommend for sort of like things to study or specialize in or whatever, like honestly, I think, like I said, like there are so many different types of programming that happen in games. I think if you want to be one of the more I don't know, like glamorous, like hands-on, like the player actually interacts with your stuff work, like rendering or gameplay, then those are the areas that are going to be expecting you to like have a really deep specialization, because those are the higher demand jobs. Whereas if you're moving into servers or tools or something like that, like those are jobs that just have a somewhat lower candidate pool, and so you might not need to be top 1% or whatever in your class at something in order to get in. I've made up that number, right? But it's sort of like you might be able to be a little bit more flexible in terms of like how much experience you have and how good your resume is and stuff like that. But then, yeah, the other thing I would say is I think it's easier to get a job if you have if you sort of like done some amount in sort of different areas of game development. If you can say, yeah, I've done a little bit of animation in Unreal for this game jam, and I did some VFX in Unity for that one, and whatever, but my real specialty is this thing. And so at Riot we called it a T shape, of like you have a lot of things that you sort of like get a little bit down into, and then you have some area that you're really deep, that you're an expert on. That makes a very compelling candidate, because if the studio is looking for a generalist who's just going to get in and do whatever is needed, cool, yeah, I've dabbled in a lot of things. But also, if the studio is looking for somebody who really understands networking, cool, I'm the person who really understands networking. And so that shape of like one specialty plus dabbling in other things, I think gives you a lot more options of which jobs you can apply for.
Awesome. Thank you. And yes, networking, do it.
Mm-hmm.
Give them your card, hand it out, blow it up in a cannon, rocket that everywhere. The next question I have for you from the same person asks, well, they say, you've worked on a lot of famous games. What did you like and dislike about each job?
Okay, that's a good question. And I will be a little bit slower because I'm going to think through, because I when offering my sort of opinions about sort of things that didn't work for me, I want to make sure that I'm saying truths that are my experience, as opposed to like that they would be interpreted as like me ragging on somebody.
Totally fair.
Yeah. So at 343, so Halo 4, it was, my first time making a big game, and it I think my favorite part of that experience was that I would sort of get caught up in and focused in on some problem and spend a week or 2 weeks like talking to two other people, and we're riffing on something, and I'm just focusing on like how are those particles move as they come off of the character or whatever. And I would lose track of sort of what else was happening in the studio as I worked on this problem. And always when I would then sort of like come back up for air and look around, the game would be so different. Like in particular, as we in the final like year and a half, as we were pushing to like get the game done, the difference between a game that's 80% done and 90% done is like so much more sort of like in your face and amazing and beautiful than the previous 80% was. Like it's amazing what artists in particular do, sound designers as well, like the creative disciplines that I like supporting, their work really shines once you reach that polish point. And that was, I think, my favorite part of that experience. And like I still definitely notice that, like working on champions on League of Legends and stuff like that, I would still have that same experience of like, whoa, a week ago this did not look nearly as good as it does now. I think the thing that I struggled with at Microsoft at 343 that led me to leave was that at least at the time they had a very strong sense of like these are the jobs that we need people doing in order to ship the game, and they had a very solid sense of like this is how we do it. And I wanted to shift into a role that was a mix of engineering and design, and that didn't exist. And they like I could have very easily been continuing on my career track and getting raises periodically, getting promoted periodically as the VFX programmer, and I could have just stayed there and become that the master of VFX programming, but I didn't want to. I wanted to try other things, and it was a less flexible studio at that time for allowing me to do that. So Valve, I was there a short time. I've said less than a year. That's because I was fired. I I don't have as positive of a personal experience there. I guess what I would say is like I do really respect the way that they approach decision making of like it's always how can we get data? How can we figure out like how can we put something in front of players uh, with minimal effort to get that first data point so that we can then, the second version, the third version, the fourth version will be better and better and better because we're observing how players interact with it. And I think that's really admirable about the way that they approach development of like don't assume you know what you're doing. Like let the players show you what they want and figure out how do you measure that. And I think that the reason that the reason that I've boiled down to of why I got fired and what has then shaped my development as a game developer since then was that I did not get very good feedback about how I was doing, and in part that was because I didn't know how to seek it. Um, so in particular, my life lesson from that was if you ask somebody how you're doing and they say you're doing good, that is not feedback. They did not answer the question. And that it's a totally reasonable response for somebody to say of like, I don't know why you're asking me this. Like, can you just keep going back and doing what you're doing? It's not my job to give this feedback. You're doing good. That's sort of like the way I interpret you're doing good is like, can we not have this conversation, please? Um, but yeah, and so like if I need to know how I'm doing, I need to set the expectation of like, hey, I really need some feedback from you. Can you give me the time to think it through and to like really like give me some solid feedback? And it's cool if you say in a week. It's cool if you say, can you talk to that person? But it's like that sense of like, no, you need to tell me something that's specific about me, about the way that I'm working for it to be useful feedback. And so that was my big learning lesson from Valve. um, Riot, I think the thing that I love the most about Riot, I love Riot. Like it was great for me. Like I have an immense respect for the way that they do things, but like specifically the thing that I think is the most important aspect of that studio to my mind is that you cannot go through a day without having a conversation with somebody else about the player experience, with both of you attempting to think with the brain of a player. And that is something that it's like it's surprising how often studios don't you know what, I'm going to stop screen sharing. Why am I doing that still? uh cool. It's surprising how often studios don't talk about player experience all the time because that's what we're doing. We're building experiences for players. So I really love that about Riot of like even if you're far from like working directly on the game, you're still going to be talking about the player experience. um, so the thing that wound up being a problem for me at Riot was that with everyone caring about the game so much, including me, and with me being a person who I go out of my way to try to help the rest of the team as much as I can. Like that's just reflexive for me. It's instinctual for me. um it was possible for me to get into a position of overworking myself through good intentions of just like, yeah, I want to help the animation team, I want to help the VFX team, like, oh yeah, that's a cool thing that you asked if I could help with and I totally know how to do it, I'm going to do it. And I think like that can be a trap at any studio that gives everyone a lot of sort of decision making power of like, your team is going to ask you to do things, but you can also, add other projects, or you can be figuring out how you're going to implement it or whatever. Like that can be a trap if you care and if you are excited about the product, that you can wind up like, oh man, where did like July go? It kind of became a haze. So that's I think the biggest concern I have there. And then yeah, the other one called Symmetry. It was an experiment to see what it would be like to work at a small studio. And by small, I mean very small, like 5 or 6 full-time employees. And ultimately, like I missed sort of the structures of like having producers that are keeping track of things, and like everyone's working on how do we plan better? How do we communicate about what we're building? And it's a different style than a like tiny indie where everyone's just sort of like riffing on things, and there aren't enough people to for one of them to wear a producer hat. Everybody's got to be doing other things too. Um, and I just found that it didn't really work for me as much as I hoped it would. That like I like having the structures of a bureaucracy and the structures of like producers and meetings and sprints and stuff like that that sort of help focus on what we're doing. But I can see why indie would be fun for other people. It's just not for me.
Wow, I'm overwhelmed. That's a lot. You gained a lot of different experiences, and I'm really glad that you shared those. Let's move on to another relevant question. Sam, thanks you for your honest answer. Um, any thoughts on the different engines like Unity versus Unreal?
Yeah, for sure. I've thought about this a lot. So I prior to Cold Symmetry, I had only ever worked in engines that were not like publicly available. So Halo engine, League of Legends engine, Dota 2 engine. Well, I guess Dota 2 had the custom game modes that we built the ability, but like we were writing code that was not publicly accessible. So Unity, Unreal, Godot, yeah, those are the main ones. Game Maker are all accessible in different ways that they're accessible to the public. And so, coming to Cold Symmetry, I learned the Unreal Engine to a level to an and I'm continuing using that engine and continuing to sort of develop more experience in it. So what I would say, and so yeah, and I've done Unity just like for game jams. So my exposure to Unity, Godot, Game Maker, is mostly through reading articles or talking to people as opposed to having done things hands on. But I would say that like I think like any project that you're going to want to do, there would be sort of like a canonical correct answer for the best engine for it, like the most sort of directly aimed at the problem. Um, but that doesn't mean that you would have to work in that engine. So, for example, if you're going to try to make a shooter with like solid like top tier graphics, like Unreal is probably the best place to do that because that's the place that has the most investment in particular in the graphics engine. But you can totally make a successful shooter that looks good in Unity. You can totally do it in Godot, although I haven't seen as many people trying to do that. It would be a bit of a stretch in Game Maker because I don't think it supports third or first person. I'm not sure, but yeah. So it's like you can overthink your engine selection because ultimately, like your creative decisions and sort of like the way that you approach the problem is going to be a bigger influence than the engine, but it's like the engine is still an important decision. And like in my game engine architecture talk with CodeDay, the analogy I used was that the engine is kind of like choosing your building materials for building a house, where you can build a house a different way with a different building material, but like it does influence it a lot. So when I mentally model, what do I think of Unreal as? Unreal is in particular good for larger teams, bigger budgets, teams where you're going to have artists that are very specialized and like very like cutting edge type of stuff, because in particular the rendering is the strongest of any of the engines that are publicly available. And then there are some concerns in terms of like blueprints, which is the scripting language, are not mergeable via like Perforce or whatever. So like if multiple people edit the same blueprint, there's not really a way to accept the changes from both of them, which is a challenge for a larger team. But it's a challenge that dozens and dozens of large teams have figured out workarounds for it. And so I would still say, like, if you're on a larger team that's 40, 50 plus people up into the hundreds, Unreal is almost certainly the right choice for you. I think Unity is great for either for learning and sort of beginner developers, anyone who's doing a 2D game, I think it's going to be easier in Unity than in Unreal, or Godot or GameMaker. Um, and I think like Unity has sort of become the engine of the indie scene. And so like game jams, most of the entries are going to be in Unity, and then a whole bunch of the games that you play that are in particular like 2D pixel art or 2.5D or whatever, like are most commonly built in Unity. Ori and the Will of the Wisps, for example, is a great example of like a very high quality, very great game that was built in Unity. Um, so I think like if somebody asked me like I want to learn how to make games and I have not done it before, I would almost always point them to Unity, just because it is sort of the community around it is more on the small indie, like people learning, people teaching each other, and sort of growing in that way. Um, Whereas if somebody was like, I am actively trying to get into the industry to work on AAA games, I would say, yeah, you got to learn Unreal, because like Unity is not used for that scope of game as much. Um, and then yeah, if you wanted to work in something a little more esoteric, like Godot as an open source free engine, you're going to have like a more, I don't know, unique experience. You're going to need to write more code than you would have to in other engines, and so it's like I think that would be a great learning experience, even if it is not as likely to ship a game that actually makes money or something like that. So. Oh, and then the other one that I would say, like, if you want to put together a game in a limited amount of time and sort of maximize your learning in a small amount of time, I honestly would highly recommend Pico 8. It forces you to be on 128 by 128 pixels and sounds that only are built using the built-in tool, and it's in the Lua programming language, which is a good language. And so like Pico 8 is this really nice sweet spot for me of like it forces you to make a game that you're actually capable of finishing because the limitations are so strict. But then doing so can really be joyful because like the tools are really nice. It's just like, yeah, you're going to be making a game that looks the way it looks, and thus it's a really great one for learning and for prototyping. um, yeah.
That totally makes sense, and people at CodeDay definitely use Unity and Godot a lot.
Hmm.
So it's perfect for hackathons. And if you
Hmm.
came to CodeDay, you would know. Moving on, we have so many questions still. Somebody wrote, I've always dreamed of working in games. Other than game jams, is there any knowledge that is absolutely required?
Hmm. That's an interesting question. I think I think one of the things that is definitely true for any of the disciplines that work in games is being able to talk about the game in question. So if I'm applying to a job to work on a card game, uh, then my ability to talk about Hearthstone is going to be very valuable. And it's like if I'm trying to become a programmer, I might be talking about the networking model for Hearthstone. If I'm trying to become a designer, I might be talking about the new card set and like how it changes the metagame. If I want to become an artist, I might be talking about like how you design the cards to read at a small image on a phone versus like look good when you expand them and stuff like that. So it's like I think that's one universal thing, is like everyone is expected to understand their piece of the game very well. But beyond that, honestly, like your ability to collaborate, your ability to like talk about the way you make decisions, and your ability to like take and give feedback, I would say are the most valuable things that are universal. And aside from that, like even within programming, I don't know if I could point to like, oh yeah, here are the three things that you need to know how to do, because like I said, like there's so many different types of programming that go into games. So yeah, I don't think that there's anything like like a hard skill of like these are the things, this is how games are made or whatever in some way that is required. But yeah, so it's like your specialization of like the type of discipline you want to do plus your ability to talk to people and communicate, like those two things really come together and are both required.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially the team building part because there is so much communication involved. Like you
Hmm.
have to know how to communicate. Absolutely.
Hmm.
Um, let's see. I guess the last question I'll ask is, or second to last, is being a game developer. Is being a game developer a prerequisite for being a good game developer?
Sorry,
Is
try
being a
again.
big is being a big gamer a prerequisite?
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Interesting. I think the amount that it matters how much you game will vary from discipline to discipline, like and from area to area. So, for example, like QA and design, like need to know the genre forward and backwards. If you're making a card game, again, like I said, you wouldn't if you're a designer. In particular, or probably if you're QA, you wouldn't just want to understand Hearthstone. You'd also want to understand Legends of Runeterra, and probably 5 or 6 other card games that I can't even think of. Magic the Gathering, obviously. Like, and so like those where you're thinking a lot about like how do other games in this space do the thing, and like what can we learn from them. You would need to have a lot more exposure, and I would say like programming, and in particular as you start to move out to some of the more system level programming like networking stuff or build engineering or whatever, like those spaces you can definitely do with much less exposure to games. There are some studios where they don't care at all if you're a gamer, but it is fairly common as part of the interview process for there to be an amount of like, hey, are you capable of talking about games? And so can you talk about like, here's I play Stardew Valley, and I don't really play very much else, but I play Stardew Valley and I can talk to you about like this is why that game hooked me or whatever. Like that type of conversation is most studios will want to have, like at the very least, like I have some demonstrable interest and thinking about games. Yeah.
I would also think that, having that gamer experience and knowing like what frustrates people about games and like the gamer experience and the gamer community and
Mhm.
like what not to do and what to avoid in those aspects
Yeah.
is really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
um I think I got one more that I would really like to ask.
Okay.
Somebody asked. Let's see. What are the most common mistakes people make when they are new to programming games?
Oh, interesting.
I didn't ask that one yet, right?
No, you have not. No, that's
Okay, cool.
very interesting. Um, I think, yeah, I'm trying to get like one nice chunky thing to pay attention to, because I mean, yeah, there's an infinite number of answers, but like, so I think a lot about so I think a lot about tech debt. I think a lot about sort of how the decisions that I make right now are going to affect the future development of my game. Um, and I think like there's a balancing act of like making sort of simple enough, fast enough, hacky enough decisions that I get something together quickly that works, and I'm not spinning my wheels and wasting a lot of time before I get to see whether something's good. And then there's a different side of like making good enough technology that in 5 years I don't look back on this code and like want to punch myself for having written it because it is so bad, right? And like that's always this tension that's pulling. um and I think most programmers that I've interacted with, including myself, will reflexively err towards the like make everything pretty and make it good and make it like very polished and stuff like that. Because I think like it's very common for programmers to like to program because they like making things organized and like making things like work very elegantly and stuff like that. And I think so it's good for you to figure out like where you land on that spectrum of do you hack things together and like get them done quickly and then live to regret it, or do you like overthink things and gold plate all the urinals? Such a dumb metaphor. Gold plate everything. Sorry. To excess such that you don't finish things. And so like figure out where you land on that spectrum and figure out what direction you want to push to like counter your natural tendencies. But broadly speaking, I would say like I feel like the most now that I'm in my working through my second decade of professional game development, I have arrived at a mental model of we can't know if the feature is good until we actually have the controller or the keyboard and we're pushing the buttons. Like you can't predict whether something will be good or not until you test it. And so erring towards like getting something in testing quickly is very important. And then the key thing then, if you're doing that, is to communicate with yourself and potentially with your team about like, these are the shortcuts that I took in order to get this in. And if we like the feature, these are the things that I want to fix before we move on. So we're gonna put together a prototype. We're gonna get it in a week, and then we're gonna test it for a couple of weeks and figure out if we like it. And then if we do, I need to fix these 3 things about it in order to like prevent it from being a problem in the future. And that pattern I use all the time of like of planning out, these are the improvements I intend to make in the future, and provided it is worth it. And a third of the time, half the time, maybe I implement a feature and we prototype it and they're like, yeah, that's not good. And then then if I had done those improvements already, that would have been a waste of time. So it's a push and pull between those 2 things, and that never goes away. That's always there, that you're weighing sort of on that axis.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill.
Hmm.
I think we're pretty much there at an hour. And
Cool.
I think yeah, we answered all the questions, and
Great.
I really appreciate you taking the time to do this again for another year in a row.
Hmm.
Hope
Yeah,
to see you be involved in Code Day, and I hope to see more attendees from this talk attend a Code Day and like maybe make a game. Please make a game. That'd be fun. We love seeing that. But yeah, you guys have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you around.
Thanks, Erica.
Thank
Thanks, everybody.
you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.